Good evening. Joining me today is my father, Nenad Sestin, who emigrated to America from Croatia during the ex-Yugoslavian wars. I thought it would be interesting to get some first-hand perspective about the political crises and situations during the 1990s in Croatia and ex-Yugoslavia, and also to understand the reasons why he left his homeland for America. He is with us today to share his story. So, Dad, first off, I'd like to know some background information regarding the war in Yugoslavia. In your opinion, what caused the war in ex-Yugoslavia?
It is my pleasure to be here. Many factors contributed to the war. In early 1980s, Tito, the president who ruled Yugoslavia for almost 40 years, died. Soon a harsh economic crisis hit Yugoslavia with food rations and hyperinflation. In years leading up to the war, the relationship between ethnic groups and six republics became progressively worse, and the religion divisions became more obvious. Two republics, Slovenia and Croatia, decided to leave the Yugoslavian Federation, which Serbian majority in Yugoslavia and Yugoslavian army, which was mainly composed of Serbian officers, did not support this and attacked both republics in the name of keeping Yugoslavia intact. This led to a full-scale civil war.
So, how did the war affect your personal life?
Everyone, including our family, was affected by the war. It is impossible to escape or not to be affected by such a brutal war. The village where my parents were born and we had our family house there was on the front line for almost 3.5 years. The neighboring villages were occupied by Yugoslavian army and local Serbian paramilitary forces. Our home was also destroyed at the beginning of the war. Your grandparents, your grandmother, your brother all became refugees for many years. On the other hand, my father and other men of the village stayed behind to defend their homes and land. I was somewhat lucky to be a student at University in Zagreb, capital city, which was around 100 miles away from the front line.
Did your life ever feel threatened during the war?
Of course. Zagreb, where I studied during the war, was also bombarded many times by Yugoslavian army and Serbian paramilitary forces. They even used cluster bombs, which are forbidden by the Geneva Conventions and are designed to inflict high civilian casualties. For example, one day I was working from the university and I was somewhere around the center of the Zagreb when it was bombed with cluster bombs. And fortunately, a daughter of my professor and my mentor was hit by one of those bombs. She barely survived and still today has over 20 shrapnels or bomb fragments in her body that doctors were not able to remove at that time. Also, my uncle and some other relatives died during the war. However, again, luckily I was not physically hurt by the war.
How did the US get involved in the war in Croatia?
After almost 250,000 people died, millions became refugees and war crimes were committed that Europe has not seen since the end of the Second World War. It was obvious to the United Nations, NATO and the US that something needs to be done to stop the war and further sufferings. There were oppositions to the involvement, but the war was too close to the Western Europe to ignore it. In the beginning, the US was part of the United Nations forces that were sent to the front lines to stop the fightings and serve as the buffer between the sides involved.
What is your opinion on the involvement of the US in Croatia?
In my opinion, it was needed. I remember today how it all started when the world decided to intervene, including the United States. United States soldiers and soldiers from many countries participated in United Nations sanctioned effort to stop the war in ex-Yugoslavia. And I remember how troops came. They were all dressed in white, with white military vehicles. And actually they looked like ice cream men. We were all laughing. That was our nickname for them. But in retrospect it was great to see them, because they all had same uniforms, which it said United Nations, so you didn't have feeling that it was one country but not another country. You felt that it was really an effort of the whole world to stop this conflict. And furthermore, Toward the end of the war, Richard Holbrooke, an assistant secretary of the state under President Clinton, also organized a peace conference, I think it was in November of 1995 in Dayton, Ohio, which led to agreement between all sides and the end of the war in Yugoslavia.
So if the Yugoslavian war ended in 1995, how did the US and NATO get involved in bombing Serbia in 1999?
Even though the civil war in Yugoslavia ended in 1995 with Dayton Peace Agreement, as I mentioned earlier, the second involvement of NATO and US was initiated to stop human rights abuses in Kosovo, which was part of Serbia. It was a more delicate decision. First, NATO did this without the approval of the United Nations Security Council, unlike their involvement and involvement of other countries in the civilian war in early 1990s. Secondly, Kosovo was an integral part of Serbia. It was mainly populated by Albanians who are Muslims and a very small minority of Serbians who are Orthodox Christian. And 1999 bombings led to the withdrawal of Yugoslav forces from Kosovo.
What is your opinion of the US and NATO bombings?
The Kosovo problem started in early 1980s when tensions between Albanians and Serbians in what's known as Kosovo started to rise. Soon the two ethnic groups were completely separated. Following the end of the civil war in 1995, Albanians in Kosovo also wanted more rights and autonomy within Serbia, but Serbs did not allow that and sent their military troops to Kosovo. Again, just a few years after the civil war, Yugoslavia was in danger of another major war. So if you take that in consideration, I think that involvement of United States and NATO was the right choice at that time and point. However, it was a very difficult and controversial decision. NATO did this unilaterally, as Russia and many other members of the United Nations Security Council did not want to support this intervention. However, you have to also keep in mind that Russia was fighting at the same time their own civil war in Chechnya, where Chechens wanted more autonomy and independence within the Russian Federation. The world powers rarely agree, and as a consequence, people often suffer. However, I think it is important to agree at the level of the United Nations. However, in many conflicts, that has not been possible, and thus these conflicts continue. Just think of today's Syria.
So one last final personal question. Why did you immigrate to America from Croatia?
As I mentioned earlier, war affects everyone and everything. Croatia had to heal and rebuild itself, and science was not a priority, and I wanted to be a scientist. Thus, opportunities for advanced education in science in Croatia were limited, and I decided to apply to grad schools in the United States. I was incredibly fortunate to become a student at Yale. This has changed my life and my future and allowed me to pursue my dream as a scientist.
Thank you, Dad, for telling your story. It's been certainly interesting. I hope you also learned something from my dad's story.
Thank you for having me.